The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turtletail from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from the San Francisco Bay Area is Virginia MacSuibhne. Virginia is the former Global Chief Compliance Officer for Agilent and Roche and is currently the founder of the SMQ shop on Etsy, where she sells some fun compliance-related merchandise. Virginia is joining us today, not for the typical reasons. Typically on the podcast, people share their expertise on things they've done right. Virginia is here to talk about some of the mistakes she's made along her career and what are the lessons that she's taken from them. Virginia, thanks for doing that. I appreciate the courage and the willingness to share. Let's start with one topic that you raised with me, which is codes of conduct and policy and what you did wrong there and what you learned. Can you tell us?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Adam. Policies and codes are I think, the foundation of a lot of compliance programs. And so when I was working on the first code of conduct for a particular organization, I started by sort of gathering some of the other examples in the world and working with some of my colleagues in compliance. And I never once asked anyone in the business what they thought about it. I never got any feedback. There were pieces that I clearly didn't know if they fit. And I asked some of my colleagues and they were like, I'm not sure either. And I left them in instead of like really doing the work to make sure it applied to the business. And so I consider that a big failure. Like I think about that one a lot when I write another policy. I think, let's not repeat that mistake. We can make new mistakes, but let's not do that one.
Yeah, that's an easy and common mistake to make. I think I've done that many times in my own career, just assuming I knew what other people would want and would be good for them. And it doesn't often turn out well. So when we were getting ready for this, you said that a lot of the mistakes you made in your career came from coming from a law firm environment to an in-house environment. Can you take us through what some of the factors were there?
Yeah, I think there's a real particular culture when it comes to law firms that's just different than organizations and institutions. And so I really didn't have what I would now consider and call sort of organizational intelligence. I didn't understand how decisions got made and things got done in an organization. I didn't understand the key systems and the challenges of implementing systems or tools or policies organizationally, because a law firm, I was doing work for individual clients. And so there's not really that same infrastructure that I was involved in. I also at a law firm was doing billable hours. And so I was really conscious of the idea that I was charging a client for either every 6-minute or 10-minute increment. And I really didn't want to waste their time, their paid time, with things that I thought were unnecessary, like what they did over the weekend and who their kids were and their families and what they enjoyed. Like I really tried to stick to business and be very transactional. And I think organizationally that really doesn't work. So the first in-house job I had, like I learned pretty quickly that transactional will not get you moved forward. And you really have to take a much more relational approach. You're going to deal with these people that you interact with multiple times over your time at the organization. And so it makes more sense to sort of pause and start every conversation and every meeting with just a connection point. And I've really tried to leverage that idea of making connections with people, particularly as I got more senior. And I think as you become a compliance officer, that's something I really leverage. But when I was a baby lawyer, like that just wasn't how I operated. That's not how I grew up, and that's not how I behaved. And so I really had to learn that mostly by mistakes that I made with people. And people would stop me and be like, hey, that's not how we start meetings, right? Or, I get feedback that I was abrupt or transactional, right? And really had to understand why that mattered to people in an organization. And it just didn't in a law firm.
I think part of the hard part there also is it's not black or white, that there's a lot of grays there, and the range of how organizations keep that personal versus business blend. But yeah, definitely different than the transactional approach in a law firm. Now, one of the things that you said you struggled with was understanding the rhythm of the business, which I love that phrase. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the idea that there's a fiscal year that may be different than a calendar year, what different quarters and cycles mean to the organization, what happens from a performance management and potentially a evaluation and review cycle. You want to really understand that. It didn't occur to me that different companies did it differently. Despite being at a law firm and working for different companies, I never cared necessarily about those details. What is your major system or systems that get used? Are they in-house, or are they something that's off the shelf? Like, how do the systems integrate? What does it take to get decisions made? Are there committees or other activities that you need to be part of in the healthcare world, right? It's all about what's the next product on the market, whether that's a test or an instrument usually. And so, right, what's the product life cycle? What does it take to get something to market? What are the milestones? And so where do you fit into those? Knowing those things can be so much more helpful in terms of your guidance, and where you can really dive in and ask questions versus where you may have to take something off the tracks at a really late stage. And you want to know that, because it just helps you give better guidance and sort of know what you're stepping into. If you've got to say, hey, wait a minute, I think we missed something. Here's what it's going to take to make sure that's compliant. I just didn't have necessarily that vision to an organization. And so when I think about joining new organizations, I always think about finding out that sort of rhythm of the business. What does it take to operate? What's the average life cycle? What's a product life cycle? Who makes decisions? How do they get made? And my husband always jokes that, like, every new company, I come back with a new language. He's like, what is true north? Like and he's like, what are we talking about now? But I think there is that every individual company tends to have its own culture and cultural language. And the earlier you can learn that, the better.
Yeah, that's something I've seen myself as I've changed jobs or been to different clients. It's amazing how even organizations that are in similar businesses can be very different. You feel it as soon as you walk in the door. Now, one other area you shared with me before we talked on this podcast was the area of performance evaluations, which is always a sensitive one. Can you talk about your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to be really vulnerable and transparent here. There have been a couple of times when I have, for all intents and purposes, thrown a fit about the performance evaluation that I received, because I thought it should have been higher. Um, Early in my career, that's because I didn't really understand how the business operated and what it took. I thought just being great at my role was enough. And I got a really harsh education in the idea that that's not enough. It's how much is what you're doing contributing to the business? How much is that moving it forward? Who in the business deserves, right, because of their impact, a different kind of bonus or compensation than you do in your particular role. And I just had no visibility to that kind of thing. And the first time I did it, and also I cried, which not ideal. But the first time I did it, it earned me a conversation with the general counsel, who I've never had a one-on-one conversation with before. So that should have also been a clue. But I also didn't understand what happened there and how I got there. So I learned a lot from a really, difficult conversation. And then I've repeated this mistake more than once. There were years where I really felt I had worked super hard. I knew I had. And I sometimes get stuck in the comparison cycle of I look at other people next to me and I think, well, I did more than they did, right? And I don't necessarily have all those details, but it's really easy to sort of go down that path because you obviously hear, in the hallways what other people's ratings were, what their bonus was, and I would get pretty snitty about the whole thing. And that's just not a good look. You really want to think about and take the time to learn what an evaluation system is. What does it mean if there's, 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 or whatever the rating system is? If you have a particular goal in mind, then you need to really be having conversations with your leader about what it would take for you to achieve that. And I also think, for someone who's sort of a habitual overachiever, right? Do you really need that particular rating, or is the compensation and bonus more important to you? And really knowing what drives you. I'm heavily motivated by recognition, and I just know that about myself. And so I have to get really clear about what's important to me and why, and then have really clear conversations with my leaders about that as well.
I really appreciate your sharing that because I've had my own learning about evaluations through the years, both from those received and those given. Now, you mentioned something there that I think is worth talking about more, is that you had your one-on-one meeting with the general counsel as a result. And you talked to me earlier also about getting invited to lunch and not understanding what that meant.
Yeah, I've probably had at least 4 occasions when a senior leader out of the blue invited me to lunch, and I literally didn't get the clue that that was something important. Like, I'm not a subtle person, and so subtlety doesn't work very well on me. And I mean, that's part of why I really try to practice like clear is kind. I would rather overstate something so that we're really clear about it, because I just don't respond well to someone else's subtlety. And there have been senior leaders over the years who've invited me out to lunch for the first time. And instead of just like thinking, I wonder what they have to talk about, right? I went and used it as my opportunity to talk about whatever was important to me. And several of those went off the rails. On one occasion, I had applied for another job. I hadn't asked for confidentiality. It got back to my leader, and they sent someone to invite me to lunch to talk about it. And I mean, I absolutely didn't tell the truth, right? I was like, no, I'm not looking for another job. No, like I didn't know what to do. And so I hid it, right? Not understanding how small of a community it is, not even knowing that you could submit your resume confidentially. I think people just need to know if you're applying for a job, it's going to get back to your leader. So you need to be prepared for that. And whether you want to address that upfront head on, I don't recommend my way, which was just lying when someone asked me about it
Right.
later. But yeah, I'm not proud of it, but it is what I did. I had another circumstance where there was a male colleague, and he was looking at women in a way that I found inappropriate. And I didn't want to make a complaint. So I just said to him, please stop doing that. And I got invited to lunch with a very senior leader. And now in hindsight, right, I realized he was trying to figure out if I was trying to make a claim or not, but he was very, very subtle about it. And I didn't catch it. I didn't understand why what I had done would have merited that. Right now I do.
Well, I'm sure you're not alone in that mistake as well. I've made similar ones, and I look back at my own career and think of all the things I did wrong. And In some ways, I'm mortified, but other ways, I realize we all have to learn. And frankly, the best thing we can do from our mistakes is learn from them and hopefully not repeat them. Well, Virginia, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us so bravely today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turtletaup from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.